Present you Bruno Moser. Bruno, he is the head and partner of the Urban Design Group in the Foster+Partners. He's putting some music now so that he animates my speech. Thank you for that. I'm very happy that he's sharing today with all of us his lecture, because apart from the head of the Urban Design Group at the Fosters, where he's working in so many different projects, real projects, which means that he needs to face the challenges of different topics related with socioeconomic situations, contexts, governments that are changing, needs that are changing. But what is becoming very interesting is that he's working with a multidisciplinary team. So you have people that they are coming from architecture and urban design discipline, but also real estate, anthropologists, sociologists, and this is giving the strength, let's say, of the group back in London. And he has been working all over the world in different projects, but what makes me more excited is that this year he is teaching together with me a studio in the Master in City and Technology. So we're trying to deal with the redevelopment of a chawl in Mumbai, where on the one hand we are dealing with the context of the space, but on the other hand we're trying to see how new technologies could open up new design possibilities. So Bruno, it's great to have you here, both as a professional from London and Foster's, but also as a co-faculty here at IAAC.
Thank you.
Please help me welcome Bruno.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay, otherwise please shout. Good evening. Over the last 5 decades, the studio had the opportunity to work on some exciting projects, but at the end of the day, we're mostly known for commercial development, usually office towers. But the office does do much more. We really try to think about design more holistically. We've got a industrial design group, for instance, that deals with furniture and products. But we're also looking at infrastructure and urban design more and more, because we feel these projects are the ones that really touch the lives of so many people and shape the way the world develops. As already said, we're based in London, and that doesn't help.
Where is your notebook?
Sorry.
Where's your notebook?
Apologies. That's okay. Should I try and... Yeah.
No, it's not. Do you have this?
It worked before. we go again. So, as you said, we've been in the business for about 5 years, mostly have a name for commercial development, but actually do so much more. And we believe that infrastructure and urban design are really two of the areas that at the end of the day touch so many of our lives, and these are important fields that we as a practice want to be actively engaged in. We're based in London, and for us in London, the 6th of January 2015 was a very important date. On the 6th of January 2015, London grew bigger than it had ever been before. There were more people living in London on that day than ever before in history. If you're looking at the population growth in London over the last 150 years, you'll notice that there's a strong growth from the 1840s just up to World War II. There's a drop after that until about the late 1980s, and we're again in a phase of rapid population growth at the moment. This early phase of growth at the beginning of the 20th century was predominantly fueled by infrastructure development, such as the London Underground. You'll notice this is mapped from 1908. If you look at the black line, there's a place called Hampstead. There. And what happened was that people started building new suburbs, new housing communities. Many of those still exist. They have been densified significantly, but London very much to this very day is a collection of villages that have grown together, and it only in the very center has this sort of urban quality that many of the other great cities have. However, the World War II, as I mentioned, dramatically changed the course of London. It started a population decline that lasted 40 years, and London lost about 25% of its population. During the Second World War, about 50,000 in the London homes were completely destroyed, and more than 2 million dwellings were experienced some form of bomb damage. As a response to that damage after the war, the Greater London Plan was drawn up by Patrick Abercrombie. The plan outlined a number of new towns that are shown by these round circles all around London, all there. And in these places, effectively, the authorities started new developments, new towns, as we call it. And a lot of the population that was lost in London were people moving to those places. The other legacy we have from the Abercrombie Plan is what we call the Greenbelt, or the Metropolitan Greenbelt, an area more than 5,000 square kilometers of open space that to this very day is protected. Only about 7% of the area of the Greenbelt are within Greater London. However, what it does, it built a sort of a corset around London and stopped it from growing and from sprawling outwards. The interesting thing was that, as I said, this legislation came into power as London was declining. So for many years there was no challenge of the nature and the policies around the Greenbelt. However, today there's much more political commentary about the necessity of the Greenbelt and how we deal with it in these times where London is growing again. As I mentioned, the Metropolitan Greenbelt is an area that's protected from development. However, the land is actively used, be it for agriculture or leisure. Fast forwarding to the early 90s, London started growing again, and this is one of the many headlines we're getting at the moment in London, just from earlier this week. The side effects of the housing crisis, where the growing number of residents just are not finding enough properties to live. The cause on one hand is very simple. In 2012, 2013, we built about 20,000 homes. In reality, we would have needed about 42,000 homes. According to some politicians, we have mayor election on the next weekend. That figure is significantly larger even. However, the processes that lead to this lack of construction are slightly more complicated and probably would yield a whole other lecture. So I'm not going to go too much into that. But just to illustrate a little bit the problem that we have, this is an area called Nine Elms. Our office is based on the left of the image, which is based over there. And the area that I've marked in red is one of the large construction areas at the moment. You'll see the Battersea Power Station, which is right there, which is at the center of the redevelopment. The area will also host the American Embassy and a lot of residential space. Apologies. However, in this area, we will be building about 17,000 units, and this has been under construction now for probably about 2 years, and will be probably under construction for another 3 or 4 years. The 17,000 units, again, to put that into perspective, are only about 4 months of the housing that London needs to build, right? So we've got a problem of not only being able to build it in terms of physically putting the bricks or the concrete into the ground, but we're also running out of land and running out of these large sites that could be developed as efficiently as Nine Elms can. The problem that gets even more complicated because we're not only more people, but the composition of the households and the change in demographic also means that the same amount of people suddenly need more homes. We have a growing number of one-person households, for instance, and there's a growing number of sharing households, whereas the number of sort of family dwellings actually is decreasing, which from a planner's point of view is the most efficient way of fitting people into a city. To look this in another way, from the 1970s onwards, you see that the population, this is for England rather than for London, but the picture is roughly the same, grew by about 25%. Over the same time, the number of households grew at 3 times the rate, right? So again, the challenge of the housing growth is not just the more people coming into London, but the more people also needing a much larger number of units to live in. Other effects also are on the demographics of the population. So by 2041, we'll have about 700,000 more pensioners. We're going through a phase at the moment where a lot of the population growth is really natural growth. So it's young generations starting families and having children, which is brilliant. So we need to build schools, but again, the reality is that by the time we've built the schools, these children are sort of out of the school age, and we can turn the schools into all people's homes or so to make the best use of those buildings. However, what does not change is the city itself, right? So there's a finite amount of space. As I said, there's the odd gap in London. It's the River Thames. We got Green Park and Hyde Park, so not areas we can probably develop. So it's a question on what we do with this space and how we share that space. And you all know these scenes. Everybody wants to have a piece of it, and I think at the end of the day, it's a political decision on how that space is allocated. Just to give you one example, zooming into Soho in London, an area here, roughly 160,000 square meter of open space. About 60% of that open space are given over to roads, right? So it's the car that has the lion's share of the open space. And I think this is one of the questions that's being debated at the moment on what the best and the fairest use of space is, and we're having big issues, for instance, around the construction of new cycle highways, which increase the safety for cyclists, which is brilliant, but we need to take the road space away from somebody else. So somebody's very, very upset because they've just lost a lane of traffic, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if it's rush hour on a Friday afternoon, it has an impact on somebody. So the space is for all to share, but as I said, it's a highly sort of political debate often on how we share that space. However, I think as for all of us as designers, it's for us to consider very carefully when we design places and spaces in how we do that, because by the way we put the street patterns down, Venice and Phoenix at the same scale here, or by the way we arrange the land uses in a city, has a very direct impact on how that place will feel, look, and operate. And this is just one of the examples on how that's being again turned into measurable dollars from the US. This is a website called WalkScore. They evaluate the number of amenities that are accessible within walking distance from a property, and it's today sort of a common feature that, if you want to buy an apartment, you check how walkable that neighborhood is, because people start to realize that that's actually something that adds to the quality of life, and not being dependent on a car makes their life richer and more pleasurable. So for the purpose of this brief lecture, I'd like to focus on three main points. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of the public realm, and I'll illustrate that with some of our project work. I'll talk about infrastructure and building infrastructure, and I'll end with a brief with some brief examples of some research work we've done in the office around mobility and how mobility might be changing in itself, or maybe might be changing the world around it. We start off with the public realm. This photo here shows an area of in the city of Westminster. In the foreground, you got Parliament Square. You might be able to make out Big Ben by the bridge, and it stretches all the way up to Trafalgar Square. We started a project called World Squares for All in the 1990s, which was really trying to improve the overall quality of the space. We wanted to upgrade the standard of the pavements, the physical appearance, improve the flow of public transport, and given this is one of the main visitor destinations for many tourists, really make it a better experience for all these people altogether. Trafalgar Square, if you had the chance to visit it in the 1980s, was basically a traffic roundabout. You'll see it's bound by 4 roads on each side. To the north, that big building is the National Gallery, holding one of the great art collections of this world. However, at the time when we started the exercise, there were probably more pigeons on the square than people, and the people who dared to go into Trafalgar Square basically were kept like cattle in these gates, as you see in the image on the bottom right. So what we try to do is rethink how the Trafalgar Square works, or how it could work, and we've done that by teaming up with a number of other organizations. We've done a lot of analysis and mapping. We looked at where people are going, where they were running across the street. We talked to a lot of people on the street. We talked to more than 170 stakeholder organizations, because we realized what we had to do was go from here to there. As simple as closing a road at the northern edge of the Trafalgar Square, connecting the square back to the National Gallery, would be the very simple measure that completely transforms the way that space is used today. This project happened before I joined the office, but I was told that because closing a road is one of the most difficult things to do, what happened was that somebody set up a mock construction site outside the National Gallery to see whether the traffic would collapse, and it didn't, so the project went ahead, luckily. And where we got to again is the before images with the buses in front of the National Gallery that was replaced with this grand staircase that also hosts a number of amenities, toilets, a cafe, and so on. And for me, this is one of the great projects, and as I said, I would have loved to be involved in. Unfortunately, happened before my time, because it's one of the projects that, look, it's like it's always been there the way it is today, right? It feels very natural, it feels very obvious, and what it did is give that great space back to the Londoners. So it's part of the civic life, and it's being used by a number of cultural events throughout the year, anything from the Chinese New Year to film screenings and concerts in the summer. It's the living room of London, as we call it. So it's the space where also political demonstrations are held, and Again, it was a very simple measure. It took a lot of work, convincing a lot of people. The taxi lobby is very strong in London, but we got there in the end, and I think it was a worthwhile effort because it completely transformed the way that the space and the city in that area is being read. A few years later, moving to Stockholm, we were confronted with a similar issue. If you look at the red dot, that's this area here. It's a very interesting site because it's where a lock separates the sweet water from the salt water of the sea. And if you're looking at these images from 1642, you see there was the first bridges being formed connecting Slusen to the main part of the city. That bridge was replaced with a bit of city in 1733, as the image shows, and that grew until about just before the Second World War, where it looks like the road engineers got hold of the space and built this great big spaghetti junction. At the time, a lot of people were excited about it, but I think more recently they realized that this might not be the best use of space, particularly in such a central location of the city. So what we did is really try and peel back all these layers and just put in what's necessary and do a bit of a tidy up, effectively, in the with the public realm. So we reconnected the road and the public transport. There's a bus station, there's an underground station, which is the big orange thing running through the middle of the slide. We had to reconnect, obviously, some of the roads as well to enable circulation. But what we did do is try and give as much space as possible back to the pedestrians and the people, because previously that space, that central location, that's so important to the history of Slusen, was inaccessible for the pedestrians. So we introduced this area shown here in blue, which is all about pedestrian connectivity and access down to the water. We then enveloped a lot of the sort of infrastructure back end in a big new public plaza, and created a grand staircase that effectively forms a sort of a seating arena back down to the water. All of these measurements together then helped massively to increase the flow of people throughout the site, and we managed to go from this image to something like this. So when you'll see there's now suddenly access again for people down to the water edge. In the middle of the screen here is that big staircase that also creates the entrance to a retail area and connects into a multimodal transport interchange. Here's sort of the peel back drawing, so you can see the buses being parked. There we go. Sort of the buses being parked underground, etc. So we really tried to bring just all that transport interchange together in a sensible way, but also in a very compact way to free up space for people in Stockholm. And this project went through a lengthy public consultation, and we're about to go on site with that. Hopefully, again, as with Trafalgar Square, through some critical questioning and persistence, being able to change the nature of the city. Infrastructure, often a sort of slightly dull topic, and I hope nobody's going to nod off. But I think it's really important that designers take, as public realm, take this very seriously, because it requires a lot of engineering thinking, and it requires a lot of bright people, but it also requires us to think about the people who use the infrastructure, how the infrastructure fits into the city, and what it all means for us in the end. One of the most important drivers for transport infrastructure is the distribution of where people live and work. This is a map showing the combined living and working densities in London. The areas that are blue, there's more people than jobs. The areas that are red, there's more jobs than people, to put it simply. In the center of the image, you see the City of London, which is the commercial center of London, and the City of Westminster, which is the area that I've shown you before, which again is a major employment center. A little bit to the east is an area called Canary Wharf, which until the first half of the last century very much looked like this. As the name suggests, Canary Wharf, it was an area with docks. It was an area for industrial production. But the World War and the change in the economy meant that the area died down and went very quiet and basically lay derelict for many, many years. So how did we get from a very derelict area to Canary Wharf we know today, which is an employment area for 100,000 people spread over about 1.5 million square meters of development and still growing? What the government did in 1981 is set up something called the London Docklands Development Corporation. The LDDC had statutory planning powers for a large area. That meant that if anybody wanted to build something, they didn't have to go to 3 different public bodies, but they had one public body, the LDDC, that was able to grant planning powers over a very large area, actually. They also had the ability to assemble sites and restructure land. They didn't have, however, they didn't have to build any major infrastructure as part of their remit. The LDDC did have compulsory purchasing powers, which I'm sure helped to collect these, to assemble the land, and they also had some funding to help get things off the ground. But the most important thing was the little area shown in red, which is the enterprise zone, which is effectively an area that if you build within that red zone, you can benefit from capital and tax incentives. And that in itself was alone was enough to start off the beginnings of Canary Wharf, and this is what it looked like in 1995. And 10 years later, we're here. This was 10 years ago, as I said. It's still growing. One of the big differences, apart from all the buildings that you'll be looking at, is this little green space there, and the little sort of darkish lens at either end. These are the entrances to the London Underground stations for Canary Wharf. The early developers all struggled quite severely in attracting tenants, because on the one hand the office space was very cheap, but it's very difficult to get there. And the introduction of the London of the Jubilee line extension dramatically changed that. This is the route here shown in orange. We had the opportunity to build that station, and I think for us it was a way to celebrate transport infrastructure, and in almost sort of a cathedral-like appearance, make the use of the public transport something that's enjoyable, and it's not running in tight and narrow tunnels, but we try to bring as much light as possible. We try to make the circulation through the space as easy and as obvious as possible, and the station today in peak hour deals with about 50,000 passengers. The next stage of, as mentioned, the growth is taking place already in Canary Wharf, and one of the side effects of the population growing in London so rapidly is a new underground line, which is called Crossrail, and just recently been renamed Elizabeth Line. It runs all the way from the very east end of London to the very west end, connecting all the way out to Heathrow and beyond. And it also has a station in Canary Wharf, and this is the design we developed for the above station development. It's a wood frame construction with ETF pillows, so a very lightweight construction. And I think the most interesting thing about the station is the public garden that's on the rooftop. So in this very dense area of Canary Wharf that didn't have excessive amount of green space, we were able to introduce this public garden as an amenity for all the people who work there or live nearby. So you can actually sit underneath the tree and have your sandwich there rather than at your desk. going to take you all the way to the Middle East now, and this is the beginnings of Jeddah in the first half of the 20th century. Jeddah grew rapidly, sort of from the 80s onwards, as the oil became more readily available, and it expanded from about 35,000 people to about 3.5 million people today, and is projected to grow further to about 5 or 6 million in the future. Getting around Jeddah means you get into a car, and if you're lucky, you drive. If you're not lucky, you stand in a queue, and you get out at the other end of your journey. There's no real alternatives. I think we managed to take a picture of the only cyclists in Jeddah, and those who dare to cross the street take their life into their hands, and everybody who's lived there says that you're more likely to get into your car and drive once around the block to get to the other side of the street than actually walk across. So the city authority in Jeddah realized that going forward, they can't build their way out of the traffic jams. There's a phenomenon called induced demand, which simply put means that the more roads you build, the more traffic you generate, right? You create more space, you create more capacity, people think, wonderful, I can get a car, and you fill up the space. So no way forward, and it's sort of a vicious circle. Jeddah was a place that developed from a very fine-grained, very organic, on the left, the Al Balad, the historic center, to a city that was effectively designed by transport engineers around a mega block, which sort of is a 1 by 1 kilometer. And if you look at an aerial of Jeddah, you can see those very, very clearly. So, as I said, the authorities started a initiative to build a public transport network, and that's quite a task. We had the chance to participate in a competition for that public transport network, and what they wanted us to do is not just think about the stations and the rolling stock and the branding and everything that goes with a public transport network, but also think about how that all is going to pan out into the 23rd century. When we started working on it, we realized that the dots on the map showing the stations are really as important as all the lines, and putting a public transport system in from scratch is not only expensive but also requires a lot of effort in getting people to use it in the end, right? We're in a climate where, as I said, nobody's necessarily used ever a bus. There's no tube or anything, no light rail at the moment in Jeddah. And there's obviously a challenge in terms of the climate. There's a challenge in terms of the perception of public space. There's different rules and social agreements on how people share space. So for us, it was very important to try and go out and understand. And again, we teamed up with a large number of other organizations who had experience in Jeddah. We went out and did a lot of walking and observing to understand how the space actually worked. Because at the beginning, everybody says nobody walks in Jeddah, but again, that's the view of a certain set of people that we might be talking to. So I think we wanted to go and see it for ourselves. And yes, it's hot. It's unbearably hot, at lunchtime in July. But it's also pleasant for a large part of the year, and people use the public space. And what you'll notice with all those images is people use the public space and they sit in the public space, right? So something as simple as shade transforms the space from something that's slightly unpleasant to something that's actually quite nice. And this is one of my favorite pictures. If you notice the two children sitting in the boot of the car in the shade of the car, having a lunch break or so. The man sits in the shadow of the lamppost, right? It's a bit of shade changes the world. Public life actually does happen in the streets, very much so, and a lot of commercial activities happening, and that was something that was very important for us, because we felt we wanted to think very carefully about the stations and the programming of the stations, which obviously have to be as efficient as they can be and as legible as they can be, but they also should try and do more than just be a public transport station. We looked at the historic development in the Al Balad, and again, just looking at the width and the spacing of the buildings, the way that these structures relate to each other, were very obvious ways in much earlier days to create an environment that's much more pleasant than the images you remember at the beginning, where the roads are spaced 60 meters apart, because most roads have the width of the Champs-Élysées. You just have getting all the cars through the system. And the other thing we notice is that space gets used and the city becomes alive in the evenings, even in the summer months as the temperature drops. People go outside and they enjoy being outside. So as I said, the stations were important. The competition was to design 72 stations. But we realized that if we put all the stations next to each other, they add up to about 8.5 kilometers. The rest of the network, the actual viaduct, is about 160 kilometers. So 20 times the impact of the stations will be from the viaduct. And we sort of thought long and hard about what could be done with the viaduct, be it in terms of landscaping, be it in terms of programming, and really creating space and taking advantage of the opportunity of the vast investment that's going into Jeddah. If we add all the area of the viaduct together, we get an area that's half of Central Park. So if that's not worth the effort. As I mentioned, with the station design, one of our focal points was to look at the touch point of the station, where the station meets the city, and we, together with the client, tested different types of programming for these spaces, be it retail units or landscape or community spaces, whatever amenities might be needed by the local residents, because the 72 stations all are very, very different in character, right? Some of them are predominantly in residential areas where people get on and off in the mornings. Other ones are much more will be serving much higher numbers, and mostly a lot of commuters and people traveling to work. What we also started to explore were ways of how the infrastructure can try and pay for itself. Now, that's a little bit wishful thinking here, but what we've at least not fully, what we did do is look at the MTR system in Hong Kong, and they've pioneered a model where the revenue from the increased land values around stations goes back into the public purse and helps to fund the expansion of that network. So effectively subsidizes the future development of the network. And we're working at the moment with Jeddah to identify these opportunities where the fact that they're putting in infrastructure will raise the land values, and we'll try and capture some of that increased land value going forward, so we can reinvest that in the development of the infrastructure. Also, that as we start to look more closely at the stations, we're giving indication in terms of development densities and identify the opportunities of how we can try and provide new accommodation where there is space as close as possible to these transport hubs, because the city is quite vast, and we're working through a number of studies at the moment, looking at a number of different stations, different walk distances, and working alongside with the client, identifying possible briefs and opportunities that could be implemented going forward. There's a number of similar infrastructure projects happening in other places of the Middle East, but as I've mentioned, they're both very expensive, but the real problem, the real challenge will be not necessarily to build the network, but get people out of their cars and onto the buses, trams, and the metros. And it remains to be seen how quickly the uptake will be in Jeddah, but it's interesting looking at evidence from other places. This is Dubai. Dubai started a metro system in 2009, and they have seen a 24-fold increase over a 5-year period, and we believe that it requires a lot of education and it requires a lot of convincing, but until you've built it, nobody will be able to understand the benefits and the opportunities from that new form of public transport. Be able to experience that it's actually maybe more convenient to get from A to B if you don't have to find a parking space or if you're not stuck in traffic, because you know what your travel time is, and there's fewer surprises within that. Just to end on a couple of thoughts and, as mentioned, 2 sort of small research type projects that we're doing in the office. We've spoken about building typologies and the relationship of those 2 pictures, right? If you want to live in a suburb with a swimming pool, it means your workplace is likely to be somewhere far away. A lot of people will be traveling, and we need a lot of roads. Similarly, another way of looking at it is that just designing a car that uses less fuel doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to jam up in traffic, right? And I think we're living quite in an exciting time as a lot of technology companies at the moment are testing new ways and means of providing mobility and changing the nature of a car with a steering wheel into something that's more autonomous. The car in the city is still a big challenge, and they sit idle for most of the day. This is Hermann Knoflacher. He's a professor for transport in Vienna, and he sort of demonstrates the slightly crazy situation that we've got, where one person sitting in a very large box requires an enormous footprint. Each car probably has a parking space at home and at the office. So we're devoting enormous areas of our cities to the storing of these vehicles that probably sits idle for 23.5 hours of the day. And we can't stop building public transport networks. I think that's the only way of moving the ever-growing numbers of people around efficiently. This diagram very boldly shows how what the space take is of different modes of transport. So if you're sitting in a bus, that's just 40% occupied, and the bus is moving through the city. There's about 8 square meters of urban space that you're consuming in that moment. If you're standing still, you need about half a square meter. If you're sitting in a car with about 1.5 people in the car, you're driving at 30 kilometers an hour, you'll require about 80 square meters of space. So that's the space behind and in front of you. The gap that you leave to the next car, so you need to bump into him when it brakes. If you're traveling at 50 kilometers an hour, you need 160 square meters. As I said, I don't think cars will go away. They will always provide a mean of the last mile in terms of transportation. There's moments where I get in the car because it's more convenient and I want to, but it's not the way we can move necessarily millions of people. And I think that message is sort of sinking in all around the world. Another important aspect, I think, is the rate of car ownership. If you imagine the dashed line running through that slide is the national average for each of these cities and countries. You'll notice that the first 3 bars are below the national average. The next 3 bars are above the average. So in Berlin, London, and New York, the average car ownership is lower in cities than it is in the national average. In New York, lowest 45% of what the national average is. So people in those cities opt not to own a car because they have alternatives. They got other ways of how they get to work. They got other ways of how they meet their friends. They got other ways of getting around. In the developing world, we see the opposite. We find the opposite to be the case. Here, people in cities tend to be more affluent than on their national average, and they can afford to own a car, and they will own a car if they can afford to own one. And I think the problem we collectively have is that the actual rate of car ownership at the moment in China, for instance, is still significantly lower than it is in Europe. But I don't think we can allow these developing countries to make the same mistakes maybe that we made in the West in the 1980s, but by thinking that we can build our way out of the out of congested roads, and we really need to try and shift much more dramatically, much more quickly onto other modes of transport. But as I said, the car's not going to go away, and often in the office we say we have to look backward to look forward. This is an image of the Damaxion car designed by Buckminster Fuller next to a Ford Model T, and Lord Foster is a great admirer of Buckminster Fuller, and he's got one of these cars restored. And during the work for that project, we uncovered sketches for a much smaller car, the D4 that Buckminster Fuller had done, but it never had been built. So as one of the sort of research projects, we did a 21st century version of that car shown on the right on that image, and we started to think about how all these technologies I've briefly touched on before, such as autonomous driving, will start to transform the way that our cities are being used today. Because in many ways, the road space that we've got, which still takes up a lot of public realm at the moment, is not used in the most efficient way today, and we believe that technology will start to transform how mobility is being served, and I hope we can move from our understanding of mobility from where we are today, which is I own a car, to mobility as a service. There's various companies that sort of try and break into that space already, but I think there's still a long way to go. And as I said, technology I think will drive us a long way forward there. So we've done this particular project a few years back, but more recently did a piece of work for Nissan, and I'll show you a brief clip to end my lecture that we launched at the Geneva Motor Show earlier this year. And there's bits about car, but really I think what's interesting for me about the clip is how the change in technology starts to change the way we use cities and we use public space, and hopefully starts to give a clue on how we can use the public space in a more efficient way, how we can use mobility in an efficient way, and how we can eventually move from, as I said, owning mobility to perceiving mobility as a service.
Nissan, we believe the future is electric. So what will the fuel station of the future look like? We think it could be this. Charged by the sun, wind and the oceans, cars could empower people to store and then distribute renewable energy. So what can we do to really shift the balance from fossil fuels to renewables? Through our battery and intelligent drive technologies, we may have some answers. With Nissan's wireless charging and universal connectivity, our vehicles could autonomously charge themselves and then repark so another vehicle on the street could use the same bay, all while you sleep. And come the morning, your house and the grid could draw energy straight from your car, powering your home as you start the day. This is not just any street. This is a smart street. The cars, houses, roads and grid are all in sync, connected. Recycled leaf batteries can be turned into smart home storage so that no clean energy goes to waste. And it doesn't stop there. With zero-emission technology, when you pull up at your workplace, you could drive straight into the office. An automated parking system would whisk your car away to be recharged, or the battery could even be used to power your office. The whole city could be connected. What if clean energy was so abundant that it became a free commodity to be shared amongst the city and its people? Our cities have the power to be transformed. Places once occupied by car parks and fuel stations could be replaced by green spaces, building a cleaner, kinder urban environment for our children and our children's children. At Nissan, we want to unlock the true potential hidden in our cities, and we believe that zero-emission and piloted drive technologies could be the key. What if the fuel station of the future wasn't a fuel station at all? We believe the fuel station of the future is your home, your street, your city, your car.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Bruno, for showing us on one side these very real solutions to a series of urban challenges, but also I like how you closed with a bit more of a speculative approach. I'd like to invite anyone who has any questions to raise their hand so I can give them the microphone. Well, I kind of have a question, but I think Areti has the same question. No, sobre cómo se transforma la ciudad, si
Talking about, it was an amazing lecture, thank you for that, but talking about smart technologies and smart technologies which transform the mobility in the future, has there been any projects in the office or in the research section which thinks about, or researches about these smart technologies being the design driving factor and incorporating that on an urban platform for the future, which plays a major role in the urban space?
Yeah, good question. There's a number of projects. I think the one I can talk about might be a piece of work we've done a while back, looking at how we can use technology more efficiently in developing countries, where at the moment there's not sufficient building services, for instance, available for in a building, and we did a project called the Heart Unit, which was looking at bringing together a number of building services in a effectively box that can be centralized within a home, and that box would try and would deliver anything from your hot water to your cooling, and it would be connected to your oven and your hob, etc. So you take most advantage, sort of the best use of the electricity and the heater and so on. I think there's a bigger question there in terms of smart city and technology, which comes up in a lot of the master planning projects, but I think a lot of that at our end is sort of in development and not quite ready to be discussed.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I've got a question about the future of mobility, and you sort of touched on what I'm interested in, where you've got the problem of our cities are kind of coordinated around our mobility. And as society is about to change with the introduction of this new technology, I wonder if, because certain places in the world are still building as we would have built 50 years ago, what sort of objectives should we be reaching for to kind of lead by example, or what sort of future morals in society do you think mobility could create an impact on?
I do believe that projects like the ones I've mentioned, which is putting in these cycle highways in London, are a good example, because they, even though they're a sort of small measure, but they send a signal to the world about how we want to use that limited amount of public space that we've got, and that we change the priority from the car to people who cycle, for instance, and we let people cycle in a safe environment. And I think that's really important. I think the bigger challenge is really getting, as I said, a lot of the nations that are growing at rapid pace at the moment, to change course and as I've mentioned, not make the same mistakes that we did. And I think we've done a piece of work last year in Beijing, looking at some of the challenges that the city is facing. At the end of the day, it's very similar issues that every other city has. It's about pollution and land uses and sort of making the taxes stack up, etc. And we had lengthy conversations with various government bodies about the way mobility is provided at the moment, and we compared the transport network between different cities, etc. And I do think at the end of the day, and I'm not sure how it is going to happen, but I think on a very senior political level, there needs to be a shift and a commitment to building public transport infrastructure, because otherwise, it's going to be tricky for all of us, and I think we're all going to suffer.
Thank you, Bruno, for your very nice lecture. I know that there are millions of projects that you cannot show because, confidentiality and these kind of things. But I want to ask you that, like working on the urban design and on the urban scale, in real projects, it requires a lot of strategic planning, because the timings are different. It's not the same to design and build a house or design and build a building, and it's not obviously the same to build a whole metro infrastructure out of scratch in a city, or even getting a step further to design a whole part or a whole new city. So my question is that when we see the technology running with so quick rhythms, actually with the speed of internet, basically, and we see that mentalities are being changed as well, because the way that we live is totally different just because we have a smartphone and we communicate differently with the built space, or even our cars. We don't own cars, we share cars, or our cars are much smaller and they can be parked by themselves like all over in different levels in the city. So when we have all these kind of changes happening, my question is how, as urban designers, we can start designing and planning for something that it will be built in 10 years or even in 15 years, where the needs are totally different, and how can we anticipate those changes, or how can we build spaces that probably might be able to adapt to those changes?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I got an answer to it. I think there's two sides to this and to the general debate around smart cities and how technology changes the way cities operate. And the one aspect is what you just mentioned, where technology moves at incredible pace. Things are possible today that we couldn't think of 5 or 10 years ago, and they're completely commonplace. On the other hand, some things haven't changed, right? So we're still living everybody has a home, and they like to have the living room and their space, and they like to go to the park, and they like to see other people, etc. And so part of me sort of thinks that as long as we think about people when we design. Technology effectively is a mean to make, maybe more intelligent spaces or better spaces. But at the end of the day, I think our needs are not going to change, that dramatically. And it's a sort of, there's sort of these two directions, and the truth is probably somewhere in between. But good question. But it's I think something to debate for everybody at the end of the day, because as I said, it's the problem with the future, right? I mean, we're not quite sure where it's going. I think when we think about places like Jeddah. A lot of work goes into not just making, the buildings or the structures or the stations look nice, but a lot of work goes into construction technology and thinking about how you put things together, and more, I think, how we take things apart again, right? And sort of the cradle as a material approach is one of those. Is one of those examples of thinking about the future, knowing that I think admitting that we don't quite know what's coming might be not a bad starting place in that debate.
I have a question as well. Thanks for the lecture. You talked at some point about mobility being considered kind of like a commodity or kind of like a public good, and witnessing now the paradigm shift of co-working, cases like WeWork or other co-working spaces that are really booming right now. What is your take on co-living? You think it's possible at some point that we actually don't own a specific dwelling?
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting examples that I'm aware of, at least in sort of large cities like New York and London, where there is a market where new housing products are being invented. One thing we're observing right now is that I've mentioned the demographics start to change. The housing crisis and the crisis of affordability has an impact on how people live, and there's, for instance, new developments that offer quite small private spaces, but much large communal spaces. So you can, you live with 20 other people, and there's an enormous dining room where you all, sit and eat together, etc. So, there's definitely new products being invented. I don't think other ones necessarily will go away. I think we'll find that there's more diversity within the in the way that we'll live in the future. But again, and I might be slightly conservative in that view, but I think at least for the next, I can see myself living the same way in 10 years that I do now, where I'm quite happy to come home and not having to see too many other people because I had a very busy day at work. So it will be interesting. But I think, as I said, I think it will definitely diversify, and there will be new ways. There will be new ways of of living. But it doesn't mean that I think the fantasy of having a house in the green for a lot of people still is there, and is very a big aspiration. I think particularly in England or in London, there's so much history around terraced housing and what it means to have a garden and so on, and I think that's sort of very deeply ingrained in the DNA of a lot of the residents, probably.
So if there are no more questions, I'd like to invite you all to thank Bruno once again.